Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review, the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking. So often in the reading world, we're chasing the latest new release. So how nice it was to talk to someone who specialises in seeking out books from the past. Simon Thomas has an unusual take on a book club in which he and like-minded book bloggers tackle books from a particular year of the past century. He joined me in the shed and we began with how the Book of the Year Club got started.
I'm always looking for ways that different bloggers can come together to do things together they wouldn't be able to do individually, I guess. Lots of us who do book vlogs are also in real life book clubs, but there is something nice about taking that solitary activity of reading and writing about it and finding ways to do something collaborative. And so I thought, what would happen if we all read books from the same year? And we started with 1924, mostly because I love the 1920s, and I think if in doubt, choose the 1920s is my answer to more or less everything except dentistry. And I thought, yes, if I was going to do a reading project where I read lots of things from 1924, in a year I could, read 100 or something. But if I do a week and there's 50 of us doing it, then we can do 100 in a week. And whilst obviously we're not all reading the same books, together by reading different book reviews that people have written, we can put together some sort of understanding of what the year is like. I didn't know how many people would want to join in. I thought it's quite a low stakes club to join in with, because if you're saying everyone should read, I don't know, Mrs. Dalloway or something, everyone has to A, want to read it, B, find it, C, finish it and review it. This one, everyone can probably find a book that's published in, say, 1924. And that can be a children's book, it can be a book that's written in another language, it can be short stories. It felt like a really nice way to get people collaboratively to do something that was not too demanding for them, but would, I thought, be quite an interesting literary experiment as well as something fun.
And then do you have a sort of central point then where you're summarising all these different reviews? And
so on both my blog and Karen's blog, we'll have a list of just links out to all of the different reviews, and we'll group together anyone who's reviewed the same book, which does happen. And we'll both attempt a sort of overview. Obviously, again, we've not read all those books, but we've read the reviews. So 1924, for example, it was interesting. I think I've often thought of it as being a time of change, the Bloomsbury Group and post-war, lots of exciting things happening. The first book I read for it was George Moore's Conversations in Ebury Street, a book at the end of quite a long career. So he was just looking at this as the end of an epoch, I guess, his own life and his own career and his own understanding of society. So it was putting together things like that, where it is not the bright young things, it's the decaying old things with the bright young things. And then something we've noticed for every year we've done is there's always a thriving detective novel scene going on. And Simenon seems to have written something in every year of the 20th century, as far as I can tell. He pops up each time. After the 1920s, we do it every 6 months. We did 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. That got a bit too modern for our liking, so we stopped in the 70s. Random.org chose our next year, which was 1944, which is the most recent one we did last October.
What's random.org? Will it generate
it's a random
answers
number
to
generator,
random...
yes. So we just put in between 1920 and 1979, I think, and thought we'll do what it says. And that was actually the first wartime year we'd done. We'd managed to skip around the war in the 30s and 40s. So that was interesting. And then the next one is next April. And that one we asked for suggestions from people with reasons behind their suggestions. And we chose 1965.
I like that on the one hand, it seems like almost a certain nostalgia, preferring to read these older books. And yet at the same time, there's this lovely, really embracing of modern technology and the different ways that you can bring people together.
And I do think that is a nice paradox about particularly the book blogging world, or corner of it that I inhabit. When people ask me what sort of books are my favourite books, I always say what housewives were reading in the 1930s. And so it's that corner of the book blogging world. But obviously, we're bloggers. We're on the internet. It's not just in our living room. It's a sort of community that, in some ways, those writers would never have imagined. In other ways, the middlebrow reading community of the 1920s and 30s, they started the Book of the Month Club and all those sorts of things. In some ways, it's very tangentially a descendant of that community of readers set in their own homes, coming together through whatever the most advanced technology of the time is, be that post or now internet.
Makes me think of E.M. Delafield's Provincial Lady and her
of,
Time
yes.
and Tide.
Yes.
But is that the book subscription that she has? And she's always grumbling about the things that they send her.
She uses the Book Society, which I wrote a section of my DPhil thesis all about the Book Society, and used the Provincial Lady as largely as my representative middlebrow reader who was receiving these and thinking, I can't remember the exact quote, but she says something along the lines of she doesn't at all want to read the book, and then reads the description and sees this response has been anticipated by the Book Society, and she feels very aggrieved. I mean, in any way that I can be like the Provincial Lady, I'm willing to embrace it. So yes.
We should all aspire to that. And so Tell me about those years. Have there been any standout years?
So we've done 24, 38, 47, 51, 68, 77 and 44. And I have mostly been surprised by continuing to love some of the section I found each time. I thought, as we got nearer the present, that I would get more and more uncomfortable. 1951, I think, was my favourite selection. I can only remember one of the books I read, which was Beverly Nichols' Mary Hall. Do you know Beverly Nichols?
No, and so whenever I sort of read things that you've written or
Yes.
listen to your podcast, there are always things I've never heard of. That's why I was so interested to talk to you.
Well, Beverly Nichols is one of those authors I'd bought a lot of books by and had never read. I just sort of assumed I would like him. And him is one of the things that maybe not all your listeners would know. Beverly was a man. I don't know how many other Beverlys there were out there, but he was certainly male. And he wrote these books that, well, he wrote many different types of books, but Mary Hall and his most famous ones were about gardening and doing up his house, but it's also extremely funny. He's very caustic about his neighbours and sort of just village gossip with the background of where to put the rhododendrons. That I really enjoyed. I don't think it would be a very good book club book for a book club discussion where everyone's read it, but I think it was really good for that sort of thing where it helps you understand early 1950s a bit better, saying this book was very popular at the time. How does that fit alongside what we know of the 1950s?
And how do you work out what books were the books that everyone was reading? How do you research that?
That's a good question. I think we don't research that enough, other than knowing which books there are lots of copies around in second-hand bookshops, probably, and which ones people tend to have. When we're selecting a year, or particularly when Karen and I were the deciders of what year it would be, I go to 1951 in literature or whatever Wikipedia page to make sure that there was at least one or two that people are likely to have heard of. So say when we did 1938, Rebecca was published in 1938. So if people panicked and didn't know what to read, they could read that. And so Wikipedia will tell you a few things. Things like Beverly Nichols, I knew just because the edition I had was reprint edition. It was one of the mass market ones at the time, obviously sold in these hundreds of thousands. What we do like is people to go as niche as possible, I suppose. We don't want everyone to read exactly the same book. I feel we want breadth mostly. The most we've ever had reading the same book, I think, was 5 people, which was Quartet in Autumn by Barbara Pym in 1977, somewhat surprisingly, but I don't know how popular that was in 1977. It's not so much looking at the ones that have survived or even the ones that were most read at the time, but just trying to get as much of a sense of possible of what that year was like for as many different people as possible.
Are these books that are really good, or is there a reason that we've forgotten them?
Many of them have been brilliant. I remember the first time I discovered that a book I loved was not in print, and this sort of shook my understanding of the publishing industry. Where, how is it that a book this good, which was Miss Hargreaves by Frank Baker, which thankfully is now back in print. But
what year is that from?
That's from 1940, so it wasn't actually for one of these years. I read that when I was 17, I think, but it's still my favourite book. My cat is named after the lead character. And yes, I just thought, how has this happened? I think that publishing is very fickle. There's a million different reasons why a book will or will not be reprinted, and I think quality certainly is one of those reasons, but it's very far from being the only one, not least because of volume. If all the good books were kept in print, publishers wouldn't manage to do it, I suppose. So one of the other books I think is brilliant that I read is from when we did 1947 Club, was Silvia Townsend Warner's short stories. That collection was called The Museum of Cheats, and she is in print with Lolly Willows, which is still relatively well known, I suppose, but she is actually, I think, better as a short story writer than a novelist. I was so pleased that the club made me go back and read that or pick it off my shelves. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why short stories don't stay in print as well, but each time I think we find at least 3/4 of the books that people are reviewing, they say are good or very good. It's not often that people will say this book deserved to die in whichever year this was. I have to say, I don't know what you think about this. I never really understand what people mean by the word dated. I know you didn't use that word, but if you use the word dated about a book, what do you tend to mean?
Well, I was just wondering just now whether it's difficult to read things when you've lost the cultural context, and whether that's what dates things. Are they still relevant? Do they still speak to us in the same way? Laura and I were talking about Elizabeth Gaskell the other day,
yes.
Wives and Daughters, and it's like she's sitting next to you on the sofa. It's like there's no distance between you and her, and it speaks to you in the same way now as I imagine it would have spoken to people then. And to me, that's just a classic. It's something that completely transcends time, but not all books do that. But does that matter? Sometimes maybe that doesn't matter.
I find it matters less with books from, say the first half of the 20th century. I think one of the reasons perhaps that we haven't gone into the 80s and 90s is that it's much more glaring if it's in the recent past, particularly if it's in living memory, particularly if it's about, racism or attitudes that hopefully we've moved on from. You notice the cultural clash more glaringly if it's not something that, Elizabeth Gaskell obviously over a century ago, and you're able to compartmentalise that, or I'm able to compartmentalise that more easily than if I'm reading a 1985 novel that shocks me for its attitudes to whatever. But yeah, I think it definitely does help to understand if you're, let's go to the 1920s again, to understand the cultural context a bit more, and maybe the novels that have survived are those that don't depend on that. So I don't know if there's a hard and fast rule.
So then another question of mine was, will you read contemporary fiction or non-fiction? Obviously you will.
Yes.
You don't run in horror for a book from the 21st century.
Yes, I think I probably read a fairly representative percentage, I guess, of modern books. It's just that I don't load my reading that way. So I read, yes. I'm listening to Michelle Obama's autobiography at the moment.
Are you?
In the car.
Any good?
It's very good. And she reads it herself, and she reads beautifully. It's very thorough. It's very long. I think it probably doesn't need to be as long as it is, but sort of clear-eyed about her marriage and about motherhood and about her career. At the moment, well, as far as I've got, Barack's just become a senator, so I'm looking forward to seeing what it's like moving into the White House in 4 years' time.
Yeah, you're making me want to read it now.
So in the next episode of Tea or Books with Rachel, we're doing 2 novels by Edward Carey, one of which is Little, which came out this year. I don't know if you know about that, but it's a novelisation of Madame Tussauds' life, which is really good. And we'll be comparing that to Alva and Irva, which is about twins in a mythical city who recreate it from plasticine. So I've been rereading that on the train this morning.
Wow.
Which is also very good. So yes, I probably read about 2 or 3 books each year that are published that year, but rarely just on spec. It's sort of an author I already know I like, or a book that's been recommended by a friend, or occasionally for book club. We tend to avoid books that are only in hardback, just so people can get hold of them. But
And do you have any books you think would make for really good book club books that you'd recommend a book club to try?
I was going through all the different books I've read for these club years to see which ones I thought would be good for a book club, and the one I chose was Another Part of the Woods by Beryl Bainbridge. Have you read any Beryl Bainbridge?
No.
That's okay. She died 10 or more years ago, but she I think is most known in literary circles for being the author who was most nominated for the book without winning.
That's right. And then in the end, they felt so ashamed of themselves, they gave her a special prize.
Yes, they did. The Best of Bainbridge. And I can't remember which one won the Best of Bainbridge, or indeed if Another Part of the Woods was nominated for the Booker. It was her second novel. So she started writing, I think, in the early 60s, and this was 1968. It's about extended family going to a holiday camp in Wales, but the holiday camp, in the way it's described, also seems quite like a prison camp. Much like many of her novels, there's sort of unexpected catastrophes and disintegrating relationships, and you're never quite sure what's going on because she doesn't tell you everything. She's a very spare writer. I was reading in the introduction to the edition I had that her initial drafts were 10 times the length of her final drafts, and she does take out everything that she didn't think absolutely had to be there. So it's a very disorienting book, but I think that would make for fun at a book club where you're trying to A, work out what's happening, and then B, I think there's a lot to talk about in the way she writes and how she conveys meaning, and how she, with saying almost nothing about them, gives you these characters where you feel very strongly about them, even if you don't quite know what they're like or what they're doing, but she makes you respond very vividly to them.
That sounds great. Yeah. And what year are you doing now?
So the next one is 1965. We're not doing that till April. I don't know what I'll be reading yet, but
you're looking forward to it.
Looking forward to something. Yes, I have to say, even though we did select it, I did look through my books and think, I don't think I've got anything I want to read from 1965, but I'm sure when it comes around, I'll find something. If not, I'll go to the library.
And so if people want to join in, they sort of can't really unless they have a book reviewing blog, or can they?
We've tried to broaden it a bit so we can do reviews on Goodreads or Library Thing, or there's some people who just put reviews in the comments on the Roundup post. That's encouraged as well. We always put the hashtag on Instagram and get people to join in there if they want to. I'm very keen that people join in whatever way they can. And obviously they can read it and not contribute any words, but it'd be great if they did.
And then they can find you at the website?
stuckinabook.com or Simon David Thomas on Instagram.
Great. Well, Simon, it's been such a delight talking to you. I feel inspired about reading old books from the past.
Perfect. It's been lovely.
Thanks so much for having
me.
Thanks.
That's all for this episode. I loved Simon's take on reading, and if, like me, you want to try some of his suggestions, here's a quick recap of some of the books he mentioned. Mary Hall by Beverly Nichols, Quartet in Autumn by Barbara Pym, Miss Hargreaves by Frank Baker, The Museum of Cheats by Silvia Townsend Warner, Little and Alva and Irva, both by Edward Carey, and Simon's top book club suggestion, Another Part of the Woods by Beryl Bainbridge. Don't miss Simon's website, stuckinabook.com, where among many other wonderful things, he has a list of 50 books you must read but may not have heard about. Some great inspiration for book club reads in his reviews there. And if you want to hear more from him, check out his podcast, Tea or Books, which you'll find on iTunes. On our next book club show, we'll be discussing A Different Drummer by William Melvin Kelly. It's the latest book read by Laura's Book Club, a forgotten classic resurrected by a recent New Yorker article. We're pairing that up with If Beale Street Could Talk by William Baldwin, which was my last book club read. Both books are highly thought of, but did they make for good book club books? Listen in to find out. Next up on the Book Club Review is our bookshelf show, in which we discuss the books we've been reading outside of our book clubs, the ones we get to pick and choose. Look out for that on our iTunes feed. If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, do subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have time, leave us a review. We'd love to get your feedback. But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.